Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to our final class in our course on the Pentateuch. Today we've come to the small southeastern Idaho town of American Falls, and it's appropriate because in this last class we're going to discuss the Book of Deuteronomy. Israel's about to enter the Promised Land, and they do a lot of remembering. You can see I'm in a park on the town square here in American Falls where they remember their history on the Oregon Trail as well as their history of veterans and people who died in the wars, especially the two world wars in the early 20th century. Let's look at our agenda for today. We'll begin by looking at the legacy of the Book of Deuteronomy and answer the question posed by its common name, Deuteronomy. Is this book a second law? Then we'll do an outline, a synchronic survey of the book. Then we'll speak about the particularities of Deuteronomistic theology. This is going to be a major point not only for our Pentateuch class, but it will be important for future studies in the Old Testament. Deuteronomistic theology is a key theme that interacts with the other parts of the Old Testament canon, but also the New Testament. And then we'll conclude with an important question. What should we think about other nations? Let's first look at the basics. Is Deuteronomy a second law? That's what the word Deuteronomy means. Deuteronomy comes from the Greek words deutero, meaning second, and then nomos, meaning law. So is Deuteronomy, as the Septuagint tradition claims, a second law? And the answer is kind of. It's a second law in that it's a restatement of the law, at least as we're reading synchronically. It summarizes a lot of the ideas that we've already heard in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But it does have a unique flavor to it. You'll notice on your screen here this diagram. Deuteronomy functions as something of a hinge in the Hebrew Bible. Scholars have increasingly begun calling the first 9 books in the Hebrew Bible, again, following the Hebrew canon, so not including Ruth, and counting Samuel and Kings as just one book each. The first 9 books are sometimes called the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers have these ideas that have been heavily influenced by both lay and priestly theology. Deuteronomy is going to have a distinctive homiletic accent to it, but it's going to be an accent that's going to be carried through in the Deuteronomistic history, the historical books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Scholars call these 4 books the Deuteronomistic history because they're history told with a Deuteronomistic accent. Let's get to the basics of Deuteronomy, and this quote from Deuteronomy chapter 4 says a lot. See, I am teaching you the statutes and ordinances as the Lord my God has commanded me, that you may observe them in the land you are entering to possess. Observe them carefully, for this is your wisdom and discernment in the sight of the peoples, who will hear of these statutes and say, this great nation is truly a wise and discerning people. Notice that not only does Deuteronomy give laws, but it's preachy. It's telling you, follow these laws because they are a source of wisdom. Indeed, these other nations, these other peoples will be like an audience, and they will be in awe of how wise and how wonderful you are. So Deuteronomy has the function of persuading. It has a rhetorical function to persuade the people to keep the law. So let's go ahead and do a synchronic survey of Deuteronomy. You'll remember from when we were looking at the book of Numbers that Israel is encamped on this map where you see the blue flags. They are on the plains of Moab, about to enter west across the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and Jericho is the most prominent location in the Promised Land. Israel is ready to enter the Promised Land, but as we learned also in Numbers, Moses will not be joining them because he was disobedient in that situation with the water coming from the rock. And so Moses is about to die. All of Deuteronomy is set on the last day of Moses' life. You can see on your screen here on the far right, Deuteronomy is Moses' last speech. And as we look at the book of Deuteronomy, there's really 4 different speeches. The first 4 chapters, which gives a retrospective. It's historical recapitulation, describes all that's happened in Israel's journey through the wilderness. And then the latter part of chapter 4, all the way through chapter 26, describes the law, and it contains the different prescriptions, as well as a section that I like what Sweeney calls it, a legal homily, heavy on the rhetoric, telling the people to obey the law. Chapters 27 and 28 focus on blessings and curses. That is, if you follow the law, you will receive these blessings. If you disobey the law, you will receive these curses. Chapters 29 and 30 give a final exhortation before the last 4 chapters function as something of an epilogue. Let's look at a couple of famous passages here in Deuteronomy. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 6, we see the famous Shema. Shema is the Hebrew word highlighted in blue on your screen. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, and with your whole being, and with your whole strength. Here with love, we mean a covenant love, a loyalty that comes from being faithful to the covenant. Note that Deuteronomy resembles strongly the Neo-Assyrian treaties of the 7th century. So we think the book of Deuteronomy has at least a lot of its origins during the period of King Josiah in the late 7th century. They use the same genre, this treaty, this vassal treaty, to tell Israel, you must be faithful to the Lord who has imposed these terms on you. Deuteronomy goes on to say towards the end of the book, I call heaven and earth today to witness against you. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life then, that you and your descendants may live, by loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him. So this gets us to the theology of Deuteronomy. Note that it's black or white, blessing or curse, life or death. It's one or the other, without any gray in between. Note carefully these 5 features of Deuteronomistic theology. Strict loyalty to the Lord. Israel must be faithful exclusively to the Lord God. They are to give absolutely no room for other nations' religion. And if they fail in this, everyone is responsible. Corporate responsibility. Evil exists as a punishment for sin. If one member of the community has sinned, it will affect everyone. We've already spoken about a singular place of worship that's mentioned in Deuteronomy 12, and it will eventually be Jerusalem. Also, 2 other features. The land is a contingent gift. That is to say, the Lord has brought you into this promised land, and make no mistake, he can take you out of it. And of course, as we know historically, that's exactly what would happen. And then finally, the uniqueness of God's election. Israel is uniquely God's people. They are the people God has chosen. The other nations are those nations that God did not choose. And that brings us to a very important question. What about those other nations? Look at what Deuteronomy says to Israel. You are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you from all the peoples on the face of the earth to be a people specially his own. Israel is uniquely chosen. And what about those other nations? In the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage, you shall not leave a single soul alive. You must put them under the ban. Notice why. So that they do not teach you to do all the abominations that they do for their gods, and you thus sin against the Lord your God. Now, Deuteronomy 20 is a challenging passage, especially when Veritatis Splendor teaches that genocide is an intrinsic moral evil, and when, in this very country, people will blame others for committing great acts of violence, saying, well, this person was a temptation to me. We had an incident of that not that long ago as I record this. While these passages are challenging, at least on its own terms, Deuteronomy is saying, Israel, you are special. God has made this special covenant with you, and I don't want there to be any temptations. I don't want there to be anything that will lead you away from what is life-giving and good for you. We have a term in Old Testament theology to describe what Deuteronomy is saying. We call it exclusivism. That is, Israel has an exclusive relationship with the Lord. These other nations, there's nothing good to be said about them. And many books of the Old Testament agree with that. You'll notice on this chart before you, Ezra and Nehemiah goes even stronger. 1st and 2nd Maccabees also is pretty strong. Ezekiel and Sirach in their own way tend to agree. In contrast, though, there are other books within the Hebrew Bible that say much more positive things about the foreign nations. Several Psalms, the book of Job, the book of Ruth, the book of Jonah, and most importantly, the book of Isaiah. And I bring this up because this will be a key point of debate when Paul is preaching the gospel in the synagogues around the Roman Empire. One final note, the book of Deuteronomy, and with it the Pentateuch, ends with the death of Moses. And just notice this encomium the inspired author gives to Moses. Moses is the measuring stick against which all future prophets will be measured, and that's an important theme as we look to the prophetic books as well as to the New Testament, but that is for another course. Until then, read well and pray well.